of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 105. The wages were paid once a month by the secretary. On pay day each batch of assistants, coming down from tea, went into the passage and joined the long line of people waiting orderly like the audience in a queue outside a gallery door. One by one they entered the office. The secretary sat at a desk with wooden bowls of money in front of him, and he asked the employee's name. He referred to a book quickly, after a suspicious glance at the assistants, said aloud the sum due, and taking money out of the bowl, counted it into his hand. "Thank you," he said. "Next?" "Thank you," was the reply. The assistant passed on to the second secretary, and before leaving the room paid him 4 shillings for washing money, 2 shillings for the club, and any fines that he might have incurred. With what he had left, he went back into his department, and there waited till it was time to go. Most of the men in Philip's house were in debt with the woman who sold the sandwiches they generally ate for supper. She was a funny old thing, very fat, with a broad red face, and black hair plastered neatly on each side of the forehead in the fashion shown in early pictures of Queen Victoria. She always wore a little black bonnet and a white apron. Her sleeves were tucked up to the elbow. She cut the sandwiches with large, dirty, greasy hands, and there was grease on her bodice, grease on her apron, grease on her skirt. She was called Mrs. Fletcher, but everyone addressed her as Ma. She was really fond of the shop assistants, whom she called her boys. She never minded giving credit towards the end of the month, and it was known that now and then she had lent some one or other a few shillings when he was in straits. She was a good woman. When they were leaving, or when they came back from the holidays, the boys kissed her fat red cheek, and more than one, dismissed and unable to find another job, had got for nothing food to keep body and soul together. The boys were sensible of her large heart and repaid her with genuine affection. There was a story they liked to tell of a man who had done well for himself at Bradford, and had 5 shops of his own, and had come back after 15 years and visited Ma Fletcher and given her a gold watch. Philip found himself with 18 shillings left out of his month's pay. It was the first money he had ever earned in his life. It gave him none of the pride which might have been expected, but merely a feeling of dismay. The smallness of the sum emphasized the hopelessness of his position. He took 15 shillings to Mrs. Athelny to pay back part of what he owed her, but she would not take more than half a sovereign. "Do you know, at that rate it'll take me 8 months to settle up with you." "As long as Athelny's in work I can afford to wait, and who knows, p'raps they'll give you a rise." Athelny kept on saying that he would speak to the manager about Philip. It was absurd that no use should be made of his talents. But he did nothing, and Philip soon came to the conclusion that the press agent was not a person of so much importance in the manager's eyes as in his own. Occasionally he saw Athelny in the shop. His flamboyance was extinguished, and in neat, commonplace, shabby clothes he hurried, a subdued, unassuming little man, through the departments as though anxious to escape notice. "When I think of how I'm wasted there," he said at home, "I'm almost tempted to give in my notice. There's no scope for a man like me. I'm stunted. I'm starved." Mrs. Athelny, quietly sewing, took no notice of his complaints. Her mouth tightened a little. "It's very hard to get jobs in these times. It's regular and it's safe. I expect you'll stay there as long as you give satisfaction." It was evident that Athelny would. It was interesting to see the ascendancy which the uneducated woman, bound to him by no legal tie, had acquired over the brilliant, unstable man. Mrs. Athelny treated Philip with motherly kindness now that he was in a different position, and he was touched by her anxiety that he should make a good meal. It was the solace of his life, and when he grew used to it, the monotony of it was what chiefly appalled him, that he could go every Sunday to that friendly house. It was a joy to sit in the stately Spanish chairs and discuss all manner of things with Athelny. Though his condition seemed so desperate, he never left him to go back to Harrington Street without a feeling of exultation. At first Philip, in order not to forget what he had learned, tried to go on reading his medical books, but he found it useless. He could not fix his attention on them after the exhausting work of the day, and it seemed hopeless to continue working when he did not know in how long he would be able to go back to the hospital. He dreamed constantly that he was in the wards. The awakening was painful. The sensation of other people sleeping in the room was inexpressibly irksome to him. He had been used to solitude, and to be with others always, never to be by himself for an instant, was at these moments horrible to him. It was then that he found it most difficult to combat his despair. He saw himself going on with that life, first to the right, second on the left, madam, indefinitely, and having to be thankful if he was not sent away. The men who had gone to the war would be coming home soon. The firm had guaranteed to take them back, and this must mean that others would be sacked. He would have to stir himself even to keep the wretched post he had. There was only one thing to free him, and that was the death of his uncle. He would get a few £100 then, and on this he could finish his course at the hospital. Philip began to wish with all his might for the old man's death. He reckoned out how long he could possibly live. He was well over 70. Philip did not know his exact age, but he must be at least 75. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, and every winter had a bad cough. Though he knew them by heart, Philip read over and over again the details in his textbook of medicine of chronic bronchitis in the old. A severe winter might be too much for the old man. With all his heart Philip longed for cold and rain. He thought of it constantly, so that it became a monomania. Uncle William was affected by the great heat too, and in August they had had 3 weeks of sweltering weather. Philip imagined to himself that one day perhaps a telegram would come saying that the vicar had died suddenly, and he pictured to himself his unutterable relief. As he stood at the top of the stairs and directed people to the departments they wanted, he occupied his mind with thinking incessantly what he would do with the money. He did not know how much it would be, perhaps no more than £500, but even that would be enough. He would leave the shop at once. He would not bother to give notice. He would pack his box and go without saying a word to anybody. And then he would return to the hospital. That was the first thing. Would he have forgotten much? In 6 months he could get it all back, and then he would take his 3 examinations as soon as he could. Midwifery first, then medicine and surgery. The awful fear seized him that his uncle, notwithstanding his promises, might leave everything he had to the parish or the church. The thought made Philip sick. He could not be so cruel. But if that happened, Philip was quite determined what to do. He would not go on in that way indefinitely. His life was only tolerable because he could look forward to something better. If he had no hope, he would have no fear. The only brave thing to do then would be to commit suicide. And thinking this over too, Philip decided minutely what painless drug he would take and how he would get hold of it. It encouraged him to think that if things became unendurable, he had at all events a way out. Second to the right, madam, and down the stairs. First on the left and straight through. Mr. Phillips, forward, please. Once a month for a week Philip was on duty. He had to go to the department at 7 in the morning and keep an eye on the sweepers. When they finished he had to take the sheets off the cases and the models. Then in the evening when the assistants left he had to put back the sheets on the models and the cases and gang the sweepers again. It was a dusty, dirty job. He was not allowed to read or write or smoke, but just had to walk about, and the time hung heavily on his hands. When he went off at 9:30 he had supper given him, and this was the only consolation. For tea at 5 o'clock had left him with a healthy appetite, and the bread and cheese, the abundant cocoa which the firm provided, were welcome. One day, when Philip had been at Lynn's for 3 months, Mr. Sampson, the buyer, came into the department fuming with anger. The manager, happening to notice the costume window as he came in, had sent for the buyer and made satirical remarks upon the color scheme. Forced to submit in silence to his superior's sarcasm, Mr. Sampson took it out of the assistants, and he rated the wretched fellow whose duty it was to dress the window. "If you want a thing well done, you must do it yourself," Mr. Sampson stormed. "I've always said it, and I always shall. One can't leave anything to you chaps. Intelligent, you call yourselves. Do you? Intelligent!" He threw the word at the assistants as though it were the bitterest term of reproach. "Don't you know that if you put an electric blue in the window it'll kill all the other blues?" He looked round the department ferociously, and his eye fell upon Philip. "You'll dress the window next Friday, Carey. Let's see what you can make of it." He went into his office, muttering angrily. Philip's heart sank. When Friday morning came, he went into the window with a sickening sense of shame. His cheeks were burning. It was horrible to display himself to the passers-by, and though he told himself it was foolish to give way to such a feeling, he turned his back to the street. There was not much chance that any of the students at the hospital would pass along Oxford Street at that hour, and he knew hardly anyone else in London. But as Philip worked with a huge lump in his throat, he fancied that on turning round he would catch the eye of some man he knew. He made all the haste he could. By the simple observation that all reds went together, and by spacing the costumes more than was usual, Philip got a very good effect, and when the buyer went into the street to look at the result, he was obviously pleased. "I knew I shouldn't go far wrong in putting you on the window. The fact is, you and me are gentlemen. Mind you, I wouldn't say this in the department, but you and me are gentlemen, and that always tells. It's no good your telling me it doesn't tell, because I know it does tell." Philip was put on the job regularly, but he could not accustom himself to the publicity, and he dreaded Friday morning, on which the window was dressed, with a terror that made him awake at 5 o'clock and lie sleepless with sickness in his heart. The girls in the department noticed his shamefaced way, and they very soon discovered his trick of standing with his back to the street. They laughed at him and called him "sidey." "I suppose you're afraid your aunt'll come along and cut you out of her will." On the whole, he got on well enough with the girls. They thought him a little queer, but his clubfoot seemed to excuse his not being like the rest, and they found in due course that he was good-natured. He never minded helping anyone, and he was polite and even-tempered. "You can see he's a gentleman," they said. "Very reserved, isn't he?" said one young woman, to whose passionate enthusiasm for the theatre he had listened unmoved. Most of them had fellers, and those who hadn't said they had, rather than have it supposed that no one had an inclination for them. One or two showed signs of being willing to start a flirtation with Philip, and he watched their manoeuvres with great amusement. He had had enough of love-making for some time, and he was nearly always tired and often hungry. Chapter 106. Philip avoided the places he had known in happier times. The little gatherings at the tavern in Beak Street were broken up. Macalister, having let down his friends, no longer went there, and Hayward was at the Cape. Only Lawson remained, and Philip, feeling that now the painter and he had nothing in common, did not wish to see him. But one Saturday afternoon, after dinner, having changed his clothes, he walked down Regent Street to go to the Free Library in St. Martin's Lane, meaning to spend the afternoon there, and suddenly found himself face to face with him. His first instinct was to pass on without a word, but Lawson did not give him the opportunity. "Where on earth have you been all this time?" he cried. "I?" said Philip. "I wrote you and asked you to come to the studio for a Beano, and you never even answered." "I didn't get your letter." "No, I know. I went to the hospital to ask for you, and I saw my letter in the rack. Have you chucked the medical?" Philip hesitated for a moment. He was ashamed to tell the truth, but the shame he felt angered him, and he forced himself to speak. He could not help reddening. "Yes, I lost the little money I had. I couldn't afford to go on with it." "I say, I'm awfully sorry. What are you doing?" "I'm a shop walker." The words choked Philip, but he was determined not to shirk the truth. He kept his eyes on Lawson and saw his embarrassment. Philip smiled savagely. "If you went into Lynn & Sedley and made your way into the made robes department, you would see me in a frock coat, walking about with a degage air and directing ladies who want to buy petticoats or stockings. First to the right, madam, and second on the left." Lawson, seeing that Philip was making a jest of it, laughed awkwardly. He did not know what to say. The picture that Philip called up horrified him, but he was afraid to show his sympathy. "That's a bit of a change for you," he said. His words seemed absurd to him, and immediately he wished he had not said them. Philip flushed darkly. "A bit," he said. "By the way, I owe you 5 bob." He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out some silver. "Oh, it doesn't matter. I'd forgotten all about it." "Go on, take it." Lawson received the money silently. They stood in the middle of the pavement, and people jostled them as they passed. There was a sardonic twinkle in Philip's eyes which made the painter intensely uncomfortable, and he could not tell that Philip's heart was heavy with despair. Lawson wanted dreadfully to do something, but he did not know what to do. "I say, won't you come to the studio and have a talk?" "No," said Philip. "Why not?" "There's nothing to talk about." He saw the pain come into Lawson's eyes. He could not help it. He was sorry, but he had to think of himself. He could not bear the thought of discussing his situation. He could endure it only by determining resolutely not to think about it. He was afraid of his weakness if once he began to open his heart. Moreover, he took irresistible dislikes to the places where he had been miserable. He remembered the humiliation he had endured when he had waited in that studio, ravenous for hunger, for Lawson to offer him a meal, and the last occasion when he had taken the 5 shillings off him. He hated the sight of Lawson because he recalled those days of utter abasement. "Then look here, come and dine with me one night. Choose your own evening." Philip was touched with the painter's kindness. All sorts of people were strangely kind to him, he thought. "It's awfully good of you, old man, but I'd rather not." He held out his hand. "Good bye." Lawson, troubled by a behaviour which seemed inexplicable, took his hand, and Philip quickly limped away. His heart was heavy, and, as was usual with him, he began to reproach himself for what he had done. He did not know what madness of pride had made him refuse the offered friendship. But he heard someone running behind him and presently Lawson's voice calling him. He stopped, and suddenly the feeling of hostility got the better of him. He presented to Lawson a cold set face. "What is it?" "I suppose you heard about Hayward, didn't you?" "I know he went to the Cape. He died, you know, soon after landing." For a moment Philip did not answer. He could hardly believe his ears. "How?" he asked. "Oh, enteric. Hard luck, wasn't it? I thought you mightn't know. Gave me a bit of a turn when I heard it." Lawson nodded quickly and walked away. Philip felt a shiver pass through his heart. He had never before lost a friend of his own age, for the death of Cronshaw, a man so much older than himself, had seemed to come in the normal course of things. The news gave him a peculiar shock. It reminded him of his own mortality, for like everyone else, Philip, knowing perfectly that all men must die, had no intimate feeling that the same must apply to himself. And Hayward's death, though he had long ceased to have any warm feeling for him, affected him deeply. He remembered on a sudden all the good talks they had had, and it pained him to think that they would never talk with one another again. He remembered their first meeting and the pleasant months they had spent together in Heidelberg. Philip's heart sank as he thought of the lost years. He walked on mechanically, not noticing where he went, and realised suddenly with a movement of irritation that instead of turning down the Haymarket he had sauntered along Shaftesbury Avenue. It bored him to retrace his steps, and besides, with that news, he did not want to read, he wanted to sit alone and think. He made up his mind to go to the British Museum. Solitude was now his only luxury. Since he had been at Linz he had often gone there and sat in front of the groups from the Parthenon, and, not deliberately thinking, had allowed their divine masses to rest his troubled soul. But this afternoon they had nothing to say to him, and after a few minutes, impatiently, he wandered out of the room. There were too many people, provincials with foolish faces, foreigners poring over their guide books. Their hideousness besmirched the everlasting masterpieces, their restlessness troubled the gods' immortal repose. He went into another room, and here there was hardly anyone. Philip sat down wearily. His nerves were on edge. He could not get the people out of his mind. Sometimes at Linz they affected him in the same way, and he looked at them file past him with horror. They were so ugly, and there was such meanness in their faces, it was terrifying. Their features were distorted with paltry desires, and you felt they were strange to any ideas of beauty. They had furtive eyes and weak chins. There was no wickedness in them, but only pettiness and vulgarity. Their humour was a low fastidiousness. Sometimes he found himself looking at them to see what animal they resembled. He tried not to, for it quickly became an obsession, and he saw in them all the sheep, or the horse, or the fox, or the goat. Human beings filled him with disgust. But presently the influence of the place descended upon him. He felt quieter. He began to look absently at the tombstones with which the room was lined. They were the work of Athenian stonemasons of the 4th and 5th centuries before Christ, and they were very simple, work of no great talent, but with the exquisite spirit of Athens upon them. Time had mellowed the marble to the colour of honey, so that unconsciously one thought of the bees of Hymettus and softened their outlines. Some represented a nude figure sitting on a bench, some the departure of the dead from those who loved him, and some the dead clasping their hands with one who remained behind. Of all was the tragic word farewell. That and nothing more. Their simplicity was infinitely touching. Friend parted from friend, the son from his mother, and the restraint made the survivor's grief more poignant. It was so long, long ago, and century upon century had passed over that unhappiness. For 2,000 years those who had wept had been dust as those they wept for. But the woe was alive still, and it filled Philip's heart so that he felt compassion spring up in it, and he said, "Poor things, poor things." And it came to him that the gaping sightseers and the fat strangers with their guide books, and all those mean common people who thronged the shop with their trivial desires and vulgar cares, were mortal and must die. They too loved, and must part from those they loved, the son from his mother, the wife from her husband. And perhaps it was more tragic because their lives were ugly and sordid, and they knew nothing that gave beauty to the world. There was one stone which was very beautiful, a bas relief of two young men holding each other's hand, and the reticence of line, the simplicity, made one like to think that the sculptor here had been touched with a genuine emotion. It was an exquisite memorial to that than which the world offers but one thing more precious, to a friendship, and as Philip looked at it he felt the tears come to his eyes. He thought of Hayward and his eager admiration for him when first they met, and how disillusion had come, and then indifference, till nothing held them together but habit and old memories. It was one of the queer things of life that you saw a person every day for months, and were so intimate with him that you could not imagine existence without him. Then separation came, and everything went on in the same way, and the companion who had seemed essential proved unnecessary. Your life proceeded, and you did not even miss him. Philip thought of those early days in Heidelberg when Hayward, capable of great things, had been full of enthusiasm for the future, and how, little by little, achieving nothing, he had resigned himself to failure. Now he was dead. His death had been as futile as his life. He died ingloriously, of a stupid disease, failing once more, even at the end, to accomplish anything. It was just the same now as if he had never lived. Philip asked himself desperately, what was the use of living at all? It all seemed inane. It was the same with Cronshaw. It was quite unimportant that he had lived. He was dead and forgotten, his book of poems sold in remainder by second-hand booksellers. His life seemed to have served nothing except to give a pushing journalist occasion to write an article in a review. And Philip cried out in his soul, "What is the use of it?" This effort was so incommensurate with the result. The bright hopes of youth had to be paid for at such a bitter price of disillusionment. Pain and disease and unhappiness weighed down the scale so heavily. What did it all mean? He thought of his own life, the high hopes with which he had entered upon it, the limitations which his body forced upon him, his friendlessness, and the lack of affection which had surrounded his youth. He did not know that he had never done anything but what seemed best to do, and what a cropper he had come. Other men with no more advantages than he succeeded, and others again with many more failed. It seemed pure chance. The rain fell alike upon the just and upon the unjust, and for nothing was there a why and a wherefore. Thinking of Cronshaw, Philip remembered the Persian rug which he had given him, telling him that it offered an answer to his question upon the meaning of life. And suddenly the answer occurred to him. He chuckled. Now that he had it, it was like one of the puzzles which you worry over till you are shown the solution, and then cannot imagine how it could ever have escaped you. The answer was obvious. Life had no meaning. On the earth, satellite of a star speeding through space, living things had arisen under the influence of conditions which were part of the planet's history, and as there had been a beginning of life upon it, so, under the influence of other conditions, there would be an end. Man, no more significant than other forms of life, had come not as the climax of creation, but as a physical reaction to the environment. Philip remembered the story of the Eastern king who, desiring to know the history of man, was brought by a sage 500 volumes. Busy with affairs of state, he bade him go and condense it. In 20 years the sage returned, and his history now was in no more than 50 volumes. But the king, too old then to read so many ponderous tomes, bade him go and shorten it once more. 20 years passed again, and the sage, old and grey, brought a single book in which was the knowledge the king had sought. But the king lay on his deathbed, and he had no time to read even that. And then the sage gave him the history of man in a single line. It was this: he was born, he suffered, and he died. There was no meaning in life, and man, by living, served no end. It was immaterial whether he was born or not born, whether he lived or ceased to live. Life was insignificant, and death without consequence. Philip exulted as he had exulted in his boyhood when the weight of a belief in God was lifted from his shoulders. It seemed to him that the last burden of responsibility was taken from him, and for the first time he was utterly free. His insignificance was turned to power, and he felt himself suddenly equal with the cruel fate which had seemed to persecute him. For if life was meaningless, the world was robbed of its cruelty. What he did or left undone did not matter. Failure was unimportant, and success amounted to nothing. He was the most inconsiderate creature in that swarming mass of mankind which for a brief space occupied the surface of the earth, and he was almighty because he had wrenched from chaos the secret of its nothingness. Thoughts came tumbling over one another in Philip's eager fancy, and he took long breaths of joyous satisfaction. He felt inclined to leap and sing. He had not been so happy for months. "O life," he cried in his heart, "O life, where is thy sting?" For the same uprush of fancy which had shown him with all the force of mathematical demonstration that life had no meaning, brought with it another idea. And that was why Cronshaw, he imagined, had given him the Persian rug. As the weaver elaborated his pattern for no end but the pleasure of his aesthetic sense, so might a man live his life or if one was forced to believe that his actions were outside his choosing, so might a man look at his life that it made a pattern. There was as little need to do this as there was use. It was merely something he did for his own pleasure. Out of the manifold events of his life, his deeds, his feelings, his thoughts, he might make a design, regular, elaborate, complicated, or beautiful. And though it might be no more than an illusion that he had the power of selection, though it might be no more than a fantastic legerdemain in which appearances were interwoven with moonbeams, that did not matter. It seemed, and so to him it was. In the vast warp of life, a river arising from no spring and flowing endlessly to no sea, with the background to his fancies that there was no meaning and that nothing was important, a man might get a personal satisfaction in selecting the various strands that worked out the pattern. There was one pattern, the most obvious, perfect and beautiful, in which a man was born, grew to manhood, married, produced children, toiled for his bread, and died. But there were others, intricate and wonderful, in which happiness did not enter and in which success was not attempted, and in them might be discovered a more troubling grace. Some lives, and Hayward's was among them, the blind indifference of chance cut off while the design was still imperfect, and then the solace was comfortable that it did not matter. Other lives, such as Cronshaw's, offered a pattern which was difficult to follow. The point of view had to be shifted, and old standards had to be altered, before one could understand that such a life was its own justification. Philip thought that in throwing over the desire for happiness he was casting aside the last of his illusions. His life had seemed horrible when it was measured by its happiness, but now he seemed to gather strength as he realized that it might be measured by something else. Happiness mattered as little as pain. They came in, both of them, as all the other details of his life came in, to the elaboration of the design. He seemed, for an instant, to stand above the accidents of his existence, and he felt that they could not affect him again as they had done before. Whatever happened to him now would be one more motive to add to the complexity of the pattern, and when the end approached he would rejoice in its completion. It would be a work of art, and it would be none the less beautiful because he alone knew of its existence, and with his death it would at once cease to be. Philip was happy. End of chapter 106. Chapter 107. Mr. Sampson, the buyer, took a fancy to Philip. Mr. Sampson was very dashing, and the girls in his department said they would not be surprised if he married one of the rich customers. He lived out of town and often impressed the assistants by putting on his evening clothes in the office. Sometimes he would be seen by those on sweeping duty coming in next morning still dressed, and they would wink gravely to one another while he went into his office and changed into a frock coat. On these occasions, having slipped out for a hurried breakfast, he would also wink at Philip as he walked up the stairs on his way back and rub his hands. "What a night! What a night!" he said. "My word!" He told Philip that he was the only gentleman there, and he and Philip were the only fellows who knew what life was. Having said this, he changed his manner suddenly, called Philip Mr. Carey instead of old boy, assumed the importance due to his position as buyer, and put Philip back into his place of shop walker. Len and Sedley received fashion papers from Paris once a week, and adapted the costumes illustrated in them to the needs of their customers. Their clientele was peculiar. The most substantial part consisted of women from the smaller manufacturing towns, who were too elegant to have their frocks made locally, and not sufficiently acquainted with London to discover good dressmakers within their means. Beside these, incongruously, was a large number of music hall artistes. This was a connection that Mr. Sampson had worked up for himself and took great pride in. They had begun by getting their stage costumes at Lynn's, and he had induced many of them to get their other clothes there as well. "As good as Paquin and half the price," he said. He had a persuasive, hail fellow well met air with him which appealed to customers of this sort, and they said to one another, "What's the good of throwing money away when you can get a coat and skirt at Lynn's that nobody knows didn't come from Paris?" Mr. Sampson was very proud of his friendship with the popular favorites whose frocks he made, and when he went out to dinner at 2 o'clock on Sunday with Miss Victorien Virgo, quote, "She was wearing that powder blue we made her, and I lay she didn't let on it come from us. I 'ad to tell her meself that if I 'adn't designed it with my own 'ands, I'd have said it must have come from Paquin." End quote. At her beautiful house in Tulse Hill he regaled the department next day with abundant details. Philip had never paid much attention to women's clothes, but in the course of time he began, a little amused at himself, to take a technical interest in them. He had an eye for colour which was more highly trained than that of anyone in the department, and he had kept from his student days in Paris some knowledge of line. Mr. Sampson, an ignorant man conscious of his own incompetence, but with a shrewdness that enabled him to combine with other people's suggestions, constantly asked the opinion of the assistants in his department in making up new designs. And he had the quickness to see that Philip's criticisms were valuable. But he was very jealous, and would never allow that he took anyone's advice. When he had altered some drawing in accordance with Philip's suggestion, he always finished up by saying, "Well, it comes round to my own idea in the end." One day, when Philip had been at the shop for 5 months, Miss Alice Antonio, the well-known serio comic, came in and asked to see Mr. Sampson. She was a large woman with flaxen hair and a boldly painted face, a metallic voice, and the breezy manner of a comedienne accustomed to be on friendly terms with the gallery boys of provincial music halls. She had a new song, and wished Mr. Sampson to design a costume for her. "I want something striking," she said. "I don't want any old thing you know. I want something different from what anybody else has." Mr. Sampson, bland and familiar, said he was quite certain they could get her the very thing she required. He showed her sketches. "I know there's nothing here that would do, but I just want to show you the kind of thing I would suggest." "Oh, no, that's not the sort of thing at all," she said, as she glanced at them impatiently. "What I want is something that'll just hit 'em in the jaw and make their front teeth rattle." "Yes, I quite understand, Miss Antonia," said the buyer, with a bland smile, but his eyes grew blank and stupid. "I expect I shall 'ave to pop over to Paris for it in the end." "Oh, I think we can give you satisfaction, Miss Antonio. What you can get in Paris you can get here." When she had swept out of the department, Mr. Sampson, a little worried, discussed the matter with Mrs. Hodges. "She's a caution and no mistake," said Mrs. Hodges. "Alice, where art thou?" remarked the buyer irritably, and thought he had scored a point against her. His ideas of music hall costumes had never gone beyond short skirts, a swirl of lace, and glittering sequins. But Miss Antonia had expressed herself on that subject in no uncertain terms. "Oh, my aunt," she said. And the invocation was uttered in such a tone as to indicate a rooted antipathy to anything so commonplace, even if she had not added that sequins gave her the sick. Mr. Sampson got out 1 or 2 ideas, but Mrs. Hodges told him frankly she did not think they would do. It was she who gave Philip the suggestion. "Can you draw, Phil? Why don't you try your 'and and see what you can do?" Philip bought a cheap box of water colours, and in the evening, while Bell, the noisy lad of 16, whistling 3 notes, busied himself with his stamps, he made 1 or 2 sketches. He remembered some of the costumes he had seen in Paris, and he adapted one of them, getting his effect from a combination of violent, unusual colours. The result amused him, and next morning he showed it to Mrs. Hodges. She was somewhat astonished, but took it at once to the buyer. "It's unusual," he said. "There's no denying that." It puzzled him, and at the same time his trained eye saw that it would make up admirably. To save his face he began making suggestions for altering it, but Mrs. Hodges, with more sense, advised him to show it to Miss Antonia as it was. "It's neck or nothing with her, and she may take a fancy to it." "It's a good deal more nothing than neck," said Mr. Sampson, looking at the décolletage. "He can draw, can't he? Fancy him keeping it dark all this time." When Miss Antonia was announced, the buyer placed the design on the table in such a position that it must catch her eye the moment she was shown into his office. She pounced on it at once. "What's that?" she said. "Why can't I have that?" "It's just an idea we got out for you," said Mr. Sampson casually. "Do you like it?" "Do I like it?" she said. "Give me 'alf a pint with a little drop of gin in it." "Ah, you see, you don't have to go to Paris. You've only got to say what you want, and there you are." The work was put in hand at once, and Philip felt quite a thrill of satisfaction when he saw the costume completed. The buyer and Mrs. Hodges took all the credit of it, but he did not care, and when he went with them to the Tivoli to see Miss Antonia wear it for the first time, he was filled with elation. In answer to her questions he at last told Mrs. Hodges how he had learnt to draw, fearing that the people he lived with would think he wanted to put on airs. He had always taken the greatest care to say nothing about his past occupations, and she repeated the information to Mr. Sampson. The buyer said nothing to him on the subject, but began to treat him a little more deferentially, and presently gave him designs to do for two of the country customers. They met with satisfaction. Then he began to speak to his clients of a clever young feller, Paris art student, you know, who worked for him, and soon Philip, ensconced behind a screen in his shirt sleeves, was drawing from morning till night. Sometimes he was so busy that he had to dine at 3 with the stragglers. He liked it, because there were few of them, and they were all too tired to talk. The food also was better, for it consisted of what was left over from the buyer's table. Philip's rise from shop walker to designer of costumes had a great effect on the department. He realized that he was an object of envy. Harris, the assistant with the queer-shaped head, who was the first person he had known at the shop and had attached himself to Philip, could not conceal his bitterness. "Some people 'ave all the luck," he said. "You'll be a buyer yourself one of these days, and we shall all be calling you sir." He told Philip that he should demand higher wages, for, notwithstanding the difficult work he was now engaged in, he received no more than the 6 shillings a week with which he started. But it was a ticklish matter to ask for a rise. The manager had a sardonic way of dealing with such applicants. "Think you're worth more, do you? How much do you think you're worth, eh?" The assistant, with his heart in his mouth, would suggest that he thought he ought to have another 2 shillings a week. "Oh, very well, if you think you're worth it, you can 'ave it." Then he paused, and sometimes with a steely eye added, "And you can 'ave your notice too." It was no use then to withdraw your request. You had to go. The manager's idea was that assistants who were dissatisfied did not work properly, and if they were not worth a rise it was better to sack them at once. The result was that they never asked for one unless they were prepared to leave. Philip hesitated. He was a little suspicious of the men in his room who told him that the buyer could not do without him. They were decent fellows, but their sense of humour was primitive, and it would have seemed funny to them if they had persuaded Philip to ask for more wages and he were sacked. He could not forget the mortification he had suffered in looking for work. He did not wish to expose himself to that again, and he knew there was small chance of his getting elsewhere a post as designer. There were hundreds of people about who could draw as well as he. But he wanted money very badly. His clothes were worn out, and the heavy carpets rotted his socks and boots. He had almost persuaded himself to take the venturesome step when, one morning, passing up from breakfast in the basement through the passage that led to the manager's office, he saw a queue of men waiting in answer to an advertisement. There were about 100 of them, and whichever was engaged would be offered his keep and the same 6 shillings a week that Philip had. He saw some of them cast envious glances at him because he had employment. It made him shudder. He dared not risk it. Chapter 107.